Hayom Harat Olam. Today the world was created. We will say these words repeatedly tomorrow and today during the Musaf service. Today the world was created. Hayom Harat Olam. On this day, 5,781 years ago, give or take, God began the holy process of attempting to bring order to primordial chaos. Out of the tohu vavohu, the unformed void, God on this day separated the light from the dark and initiated the process of creation. 6 days later, God decided to create a creature in God's very own image to help further this task. Humans were brought into the world and were told that they should name and then rule over the birds of the sky, the fish of the sea, and the animals that walk the earth. We were to be God's partners in this grand task of making a perfect world. Spoiler alert, things unraveled quickly. It quickly became clear that perfection, a Garden of Eden, a world with no chaos, would not be something that any human would be able to see in this lifetime. So what do we do with this birthday of the world? What do we do with this moment of creation that was supposed to usher in an era of order? A few weeks ago, I was sitting in my fiancée Ariane's parents' apartment, and I asked her father, not a frequent synagogue attendee, what he would want to hear from a rabbi on these high holy days. His response was quick and sure. I want to hear about the absurdity of the human condition. The idea stuck with me, because what better year to talk about the absurdity of the human condition than one that has had pandemics, storms, fires, and national reckoning with issues of race and gender. But it also struck me that while our own issues may be unprecedented in modern times, Judaism has been attempting to wrestle with the absurdity of the human condition for thousands of years. What could be more absurd than humans being plunked into a garden, told they are in charge of everything, but not to touch that one shiny tree right in the middle? Our ancestors who lived as migrants in the desert found God in their responses to conditions of famine, disease, and as we read today, infertility. What could be more absurd than clinging to our faith as we watched our temples destroyed, our people sent into exile, our holy books burned? So yes, the human condition might feel especially absurd for us as we start 5781. But what can we learn from our tradition about how to bring some semblance of order into this chaos? One of the best-known collections of Jewish wisdom is Pirkei Avot, the teachings of our ancestors, a collection found in the Mishnah, recorded in about the year 200. One of the very first pieces of wisdom shared in this collection, Mishnah number 2 out of all of them, comes from Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous, who said the world stands on 3 things. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. Al ha'torah, on Torah, al ha'avodah, on avodah or worship, al G'millut Chassadim, on acts of loving kindness. When we feel as if we're being tossed here and there on the winds, and we feel as though we are unsettled, it can be a time to return to our foundation, to our pillars, our sources of stability. Torah, Avodah, and G'millut Chassadim, our ability to question, our ritual practices, and our sense of community, these things on which the world rests. The rabbis chose a list of 3 because 3 represented the most stable and necessary structure that could hold up the world. Imagine a globe resting on 3 legs coming off of it, as if it's a stool. What would happen if you would remove 1 leg? The world would collapse. 2 legs is not enough by itself to hold something securely in a 3-dimensional world. And if you add a 4th leg, it's extra. It doesn't really need to be there. These 3 things are the 3 things that were most crucial essential to creating a strong foundation for the world. We know as Jews that today's chaos is not new. We have, as a people, lived through enough chaos to know that there's no quick and easy answer to making the world a better or more perfect place. What we do have, though, are the tools to help us move forward and bring meaning to our lives despite the chaos circling around us. Torah, Avodah, and G'millut Chassadim, these three things can be our supports as we move forward in this holiday season and beyond. From Torah and its study, we gain the power of critical questioning and a quest for truth. From Avodah, from worship, we gain the power of ritual in our lives. And through G'millut Chassadim, acts of loving kindness, we gain a community that supports each other through good times and bad. Over the course of the holidays of Rosh HaShannah and Yom Kippur this year, I will talk about each of these three ideas, and I'll explore how they can each be anchors for us as we navigate the stormy seas of 2020. So today, we'll talk about Torah, the first pillar, the first foundational idea, the first anchor that we have as Jews is Torah. The Torah is our teaching, it's our inheritance. It is the most basic thing that binds us together as a Jewish people, and it helps us to begin making sense of our world. But what is it? One easy answer is the one that many of you may have learned in Hebrew school or conversion classes. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. The 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But I would like to follow in the tradition of many rabbis and take a more expansive view of Torah. Torah by itself cannot be a pillar supporting the world. But the study of Torah, the questioning, the wrestling, the learning that occurs when we engage with Torah, that can help us. That can be there for us as we attempt to weather storms by better understanding our own stories. The questions we ask of this text can help us better understand our place in the world by placing us and our actions within the greater story of the Jewish people. Rabbi Joy Levitt, the head of the Jewish Community Center on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, illustrated this point beautifully. Judaism loves Torah because it makes us think beyond the scope of our narrow existence, she writes. It puts our lives into a context, and it connects us back thousands of years and ahead thousands more. We study so that we can study more, because there is wisdom in the answers and even more wisdom in the questions. And also because the process itself ennobles us. Torah, when we study it this way, is a broader category than just the 5 books I mentioned. We have the Torah Shebichtav, the whole Hebrew Bible, the written Torah. We have the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, the whole corpus of rabbinic writing that includes Midrash and Mishnah and Talmud. Torah can be the writings of medieval commentators, and it can be the Tichilot of Eastern European women in the 17th century. Torah can be the poetry of the 11th century Spanish Jew Yehuda Halevi and the 20th century Israeli Yehuda Amichai. Torah is the music of Miriam's song and of modern Israeli pop. We are able to expand our idea of what Torah is, not because of what Torah can be, but because of how we as Jews interact with these texts. Without the people who study it, without us, Torah is nothing but words on a page or musical notes in the air. When we learn Torah, when we study Torah, when we ask the questions of Torah, we join in the tremendous tradition of our people in making Torah. Torah is not and has never been something we can merely mine for wisdom that can be unlocked if we use the correct logic. Even if we narrow our scope to just the written Torah, we find, on the one hand, promises of utopian life if we follow all of the laws, and then later the book of Job, which tells the story of a man who did everything right and was nevertheless subject to unthinkable misfortune. Our Bible contains love poetry side by side with existentialist philosophy. Reading the Torah by itself without asking any questions, cannot solve the absurdity of the human condition, nor can it even offer much solace as we attempt to navigate this new year of 5781. Those of you who study in my Sunday morning Torah classes know that the first question I always ask after we read a piece of text together is, what questions does this bring up? What questions do we have about this text? This Jewish process of study of any subject begins with questions. The Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Isidore Rabi, who won a Nobel Prize in physics, was once asked why he became a scientist. He replied, "My mother made me a scientist without even knowing it." Every other child would come back from school and their parents would ask them, "So, did you learn anything today?" But my mother would ask, "Izzy, did you ask a good question today?" That made all the difference. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. All these questions are great, but what I'm looking for right now isn't more questions. It's answers. We have so many questions about what our next day, our next week, our next month, or our next year will look like. What good will Torah do me if all it does is add more questions to my life? Rabbi Saul Strasberg of Nashville, Tennessee, recently wrote about this struggle. "We Jews like to pat ourselves on the back for asking lots of questions," he wrote. "We're proud to answer a question with another question. And asking questions can be great, but living with questions is much harder." And that is exactly what so many of us are grappling with at this time. We wake up with questions, we wrestle with those questions all day long, and we fall asleep thinking about the same questions. Living with questions is hard. It's messy. None of us are ever immune to living with questions, and our current state of living has only heightened the amount of questions we have to ask of ourselves and of others. But Judaism is here to tell us that living with questions is a much better option than deciding to live with simple answers. Judaism is here to say that even though it might go against what we want right now, asking more questions and not fewer is the right path. It is only by our willingness to ask challenging questions that we will eventually arrive at meaningful answers. Simply hoping that the easy answer to the complex question is the right one will not actually make our lives any better. So what are the questions that we need to be asking right now? What are the questions that can help us start 5781 in a meaningful way? What are the questions that can bring meaning to our lives? I'd like to offer 3 questions that I hope that we can each ask. One is a question to ask of ourselves. The second is a question to ask of someone else. And the third is a question for God. I don't have the answers to any of these questions, but I believe that if we ask them, we will be better for it. The first is a question for yourself. What, right now, on this Rosh HaShannah, is stopping me from being the best version of myself? Now, this might seem like a bit of a Tony Robbins question, but the Rosh Hashanah season is, after all, the most motivational time of the Jewish year. This is a time when we are meant to take stock of our lives and do the work that it takes to do tshuva, repentance, and then lashuv, to return to a better version of ourselves. As we move from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, this question, what is standing in my way, is a vital one, that if we attempt to answer honestly, we hope we can help us move forward into a happier and better year. The second question. This question is maybe for a friend, for a partner, your child, your parent, or even perhaps a stranger. Ask, what do you need from me? This is the type of question that won't stop at a question. This is the type of question that can galvanize us into action. The former British chief rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, says that Judaism is God's question mark against the random cruelties of the world. How amazing is that? We, as the Jewish people, are a living question mark, a living question that challenges injustice and asks why it must be so. But we can only live up to that ideal if we are ready to take action in response to the answer. We have to ask that question and be ready to do what it is that the folks around us need from us. And last, we come to the question for God. And here I have an admission to make. I don't actually have a question for you to ask God. You have to come up with that one yourself. We're about to enter the Musaf service when you will have a significant period of time for silent prayer and reflection. During this time, I ask you to pose one question to God. Don't worry if you feel like you're being challenging. I promise God can handle it. It can be as simple as, why? Or it can be as specific as you want it to be. But take a moment to ask a question to God. These 3 questions will not cure a pandemic. They will not stop wildfires or turn away hurricanes. But they can help us face the chaos of the world with a better perspective and a deeper sense of meaning. I invite you all to ask them over the course of the next 10 days as we prepare for Yom Kippur, and perhaps by then you will have started to find some answers. Or perhaps not. For myself, what is holding me back? For others, what do you need from me? And whatever question you have for God. Now I know it's strange in Jewish tradition to talk about 3 questions. We are more used to 4 questions, exactly. So I will close with my own question. And it's a question that I spoke about at the beginning. And the question is, why are we here? And just like the other questions, that question can be a big question, and it can be a small question. That question can galvanize us to action. What am I doing here? What is my purpose? And I ask that for each and every one of you, you take a moment during Musaf, perhaps before or after you ask God your burning question, and you take a second to think about what's one answer to that question. Why am I here? Why are we all here? Because I can't answer that for you. We each have to come up with that answer for ourselves. Shana Tova.